Welcome to our journey of transformation. We're in the 9th lesson of loving God with all of our hearts. And loving God with all of our hearts is the first stage of this journey. It's followed by loving God with all of our souls, with all of our minds, and with all of our strength. And today's lesson is called A Whole Heart. In the previous study, when we thought about a divided heart, we saw that when we begin the journey of transformation, that it's possible our hearts might be divided between the desires to live a transformed life and the desires to follow the old habits of selfishness. And Jesus predicted this condition of having a divided heart when he taught the parable of the sower. It's recorded for us in Luke chapter 8. And in that parable, he talks about a farmer going out to sow seed and how the seed falls in different kinds of ground. The seed itself represents the Word of God, the teachings of Jesus about transformation. And the ground, the different kinds of ground that the seed falls on, represents our hearts, that our hearts can consist or exist in different conditions. At first, the seed falls on the hard ground of the wayside, the path where the people walk around the edge of the field. Is hard ground and can't receive the seed. Doesn't penetrate. And that's like a hardened heart that doesn't understand the love of the Father or unconditional love. It's a heart of selfishness, wholly and completely committed to selfishness. And for that reason, it cannot receive the teaching of Jesus about unconditional love. Then the seed also falls on ground that's mixed with rocks. And it first comes up, when the plant first comes up, it begins to develop, but then it can't put down roots to get enough moisture from the ground, and when the sun comes up, the plant withers. This ground mixed with rocks represents a divided heart, divided between the joy of thinking about living a transformed life and the comfort, the deceitful comfort, of following the same old habits of selfishness that we've always followed. And then there's the seed that falls on the ground that has thorn plants in it. The thorns grow up and mix with the good plants and choke out the good plants. It's a divided heart too, represented by this thorny ground. And it's represented by a divided heart, divided between the desires to love, the desires to follow the teachings of Jesus, and that are transforming, and the desires to continue in selfishness, selfishly preoccupied by the cares of this life, material cares of this life. It doesn't bear fruit. It can't bear fruit, the divided heart. And then there's the good ground that receives the Word of God, the teachings of Jesus, and produces fruit. The fruit, the manifestation of the qualities of love, like compassion, mercy, kindness, humility, forgiveness, and patience. The interesting connection between the parable of the lost son and the parable of the sower is that the lost son, as he left home and then returned back home, experienced some of these different conditions of his heart. No doubt when he first began to think about going to a far country and living a different way, independent of his father, and experiencing some pleasures that he'd never been able to experience before, his heart became divided. The more he thought about this idea of leaving, his heart became divided between leaving and staying and being responsible as a son, helping his father on the farm and living in the image of his father. It was divided. But then as time went on and this idea of leaving became an obsession to him, his heart hardened. Hardened so much so that he was able to go to his father and demand his inheritance, since he needed funds to go live in that place. He demanded his inheritance and left. He left with a whole heart, but wholly committed to selfishness. But then as he lived there and wasted his money and experienced tragedy after tragedy, his heart began to divide again. But this time, between the desire to stay in that far country and try to recover what he had lost, and going back to his father. But with time and more experience of tragedy, his heart became one again, whole. with a desire only of going back to his father, admitting his mistake, and asking just to be a servant and not a son anymore. What the parable of the lost son teaches us about these different kinds of conditions of our heart is that we can change the way our heart is. Even if our heart is hardened, it can change, just like the heart of the lost son changed. And this fills us with hope. Hope to be able to love God with all of our hearts, with a whole heart, to commit ourselves completely and wholly to the purpose for which he created us, to live with him, to live in him, and him live in us by living in his image. So what's a solution to a divided heart? You know, some people become very accustomed to living with divided hearts, with desires to live following Jesus and the desires to still defend and protect themselves in selfishness. But the result is they live lives that are stagnant and unable to bear fruit. That's what the parable of the sower teaches us. A divided heart cannot produce fruit. The solution to bearing fruit and to having a whole heart is to surrender. What does surrender mean? Surrender means to humbly admit the truth about the reality of selfishness and accept completely and wholly the purpose for which the Father created us. It means to completely give ourselves to that purpose without holding anything back, and lay down our arms, our weapons that we use to defend ourselves and protect ourselves, and instead open ourselves up to be transformed. We need to stop fighting, because in the case of a divided heart, people are fighting, not fighting other people, but fighting themselves, fighting that part of themselves that wants to know the Father. We need to stop fighting and surrender. Surrender when we feel defeated. A lot of people don't surrender until they feel defeated. But the problem is they're defeated long before they feel defeated. The lost son was defeated long before he felt defeated. He tried to recover his life, but he couldn't. He was defeated before he ever left, because that life in that far country could not have been successful. It couldn't satisfy. The lost son had to be convinced that what he had desired before was destructive, and that he ought not to desire that anymore, because how it destroyed him. He could open himself up through his experience, by his humility, to the possibility of living life again with the Father. So in what ways did the lost son surrender? Well, first of all, he had to surrender or give up the desires he had for that far country, because they couldn't be fulfilled. And he had to surrender to the truth about that far country, that it couldn't give him what his heart desired, because his heart deeply desired, really, the presence of his Father. And he had to surrender to the truth about his Father, that his Father really was generous, full of compassion, patience, and grace. And he also had to surrender to the truth about himself, that really didn't deserve to be a son because he had missed the target of being a son. He also, finally, needed to surrender his heart to the Father. And after all, that's what the Father wanted from the beginning, was his son's heart. He wanted his son to learn truly how to love. So what the son did was surrendered to win. That may sound kind of strange that we can surrender to win, but that's what happens when we follow Jesus. We surrender to win. Jesus taught this principle in Luke chapter 9. I'd like you to read with me in Luke chapter 9, where we're going to begin reading with verse 22. The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Then he said to them all, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? First, Jesus warned them that he was about to suffer death on the cross, suffer to love. And he tells his disciples that they can identify with him by suffering also to love, by taking up their daily crosses. And these daily crosses did not refer to some cross, a wooden cross that they would bear and have to die on physically, but they were like emotional crosses that they would bear, bearing the cost of loving, bearing the cost of being compassionate, patient, and forgiving to people. These crosses would be daily crosses that would transform them and save them. And in fact, he teaches a very interesting principle by saying that if we're willing to lose our life, then we can save it. Now, life here refers to the totality of who we are, our identity, the essence of who we are that distinguishes us from other people, the person we are, the desires, the values that we have, our mentality, our way of being, our way of treating people. And there is a self that we want to save, protect, and defend. That self that takes care of self and that selfishly lives for the benefit of self. We're afraid that if we lose it, we would stop being who we are. But the fact Jesus says is we've got to lose it. He says if you try to save it, try to save that self, you will lose it. He also taught this principle in another way in Luke chapter 12, in the parable of the rich fool. In Luke chapter 12, a man had come to Jesus complaining about his brother who would not share the inheritance with him. And he wanted Jesus to go and tell his brother to share the inheritance. But Jesus hadn't come as some kind of judge or referee to solve our problems. He came instead to teach us solutions to our problems by following principles that we could use ourselves to solve them. So he said to the man, in answer to his request, he said, "Beware of greed. A man's life does not consist of the abundance of things that he possesses." That must have surprised the man. Beware of greed. The problem with the conflict with his brother was greed, the greed of selfishness. They both must have been selfish, and selfishness cannot live with selfishness. There will always be a conflict because each is looking out for themselves. And so Jesus says to him, a man's life does not consist of the abundance of what he possesses. In other words, the value of his life didn't consist of things. He couldn't determine the worth of his being by how many things he had. Then he told him this parable. Let's read the parable. This is in Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 16. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." So here's a man who thought that his life did consist of the abundance of what he had. And he was very proud of what he had. He wanted to keep what he had and store it up. It never occurred to him, with such an abundant harvest and so much grain, that he could share it with people, be generous to his servants. He certainly had servants who actually farmed his land. He certainly didn't farm the land himself if he had such a great harvest. But it never occurred to him to be generous or loving or sacrificial to those who were poor. Instead, he wanted to keep it for himself. He wanted to keep his life as it was, with his values, his mentality, and his way of life. But he couldn't. He couldn't keep it. In fact, the Lord warns him and says, "This night your life will be required of you, and then who will have all these things?" Well, he did actually lose his life physically, but the focus really is on what he lost in terms of his self, because he lost what amounted to his value as a person. He tried to hold on to it instead of being generous, and he lost it. He lost that self that he was trying to protect and defend and enjoy. He lost it. And that's what happens. When we try to save our life in selfishness, we'll lose it. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. And we make lots of attempts to save our life, to defend ourselves. We use prejudice to prove that we're superior. In pride, we boast about our accomplishments to prove that we're better. We deny our mistakes to protect ourselves from guilt. We criticize, we're negative towards people to show that we're better. We're jealous and envious to justify ourselves as victims. We have selfish ambition to prove that we're superior and better. We're unfaithful, we lie, we commit fraud to promote ourselves and who we are. We deny generosity to protect what we have. We treat others the way they treat us to control the reactions of other people, to control our lives. But what are we left with after all of this? With nothing. We're left with a self who is meaningless. If we try to save our lives in this way, we'll lose them. We'll lose who we are, lose what we have, lose our relationships. We protect ourselves instead of showing compassion, we lose. If we accumulate wealth instead of being generous, we lose. If we use anger to control our relationships with people, to win the arguments, we lose. If we resent instead of forgive, we lose. If we judge instead of showing mercy in order to prove ourselves better than others, we lose. It means holding on to what is really destroying us. The lost son wanted to hold on to the perception he had of himself as deserving to have this inheritance before his father had even died, as deserving to go to this far country and enjoy all these pleasures. He held on to that and he lost it. He lost his sense of self when he tried to hold on to it. So Jesus says, if you try to save this life, this selfish life, you'll lose it. But if you're willing to lose it, then you'll save your life. And what does he mean? He means by losing selfishness, we can be transformed and have a life living in the Father and the Father in us. We lose ourselves in the Father's love and in his grace. Or as Paul says in Colossians 3, verse 3, he says, our lives are hid with Christ in God. He gives us a new identity, new heart, new relationship, living in love, a new way of life that makes us come alive like we've never been alive before. But why is it so hard then? Why is surrender so difficult if by surrendering we can win? Well, it's difficult because, of course, it's costly. It costs us to be compassionate and kind to others. We have to face ourselves and the difficulty of confronting our own selfishness after having tried to justify, defend, and protect ourselves for so long. We have a problem seeing ourselves. And we have to humble ourselves to admit we've made mistakes. It can be costly and humiliating. And we're afraid. We're afraid to stop defending and protecting ourselves because somebody might take advantage of us. We're afraid to make ourselves vulnerable by not using our anger. We're afraid of change when habits have been so long developing in our life. We're afraid of losing control of our lives. We're afraid of practice, the practice of generosity or compassion that's unknown to us or unfamiliar to us. We think about taking off the gloves and laying down our arms that we've used to defend ourselves, and we're afraid the enemy is going to attack us. but no enemy is going to attack us. We can overcome this fear. We can overcome it because, first of all, what we really need to fear is selfishness. Because it's selfishness that really makes us lose. Living in the life of our Father makes us win. So we really ought to be afraid of selfishness. And we can overcome this fear because we really have nothing to fear. Our Father is waiting for us, who's full of patience and grace and mercy and forgiveness, waiting to restore us and make us his children, living in his image. So we can be courageous and valiant, knowing that we lose nothing by examining ourselves and surrendering ourselves to transformation. If you let go, if you truly let go, the Father will surprise you, just as much as the Father must have surprised the lost son when he came home. The Father will surprise you as to how far he will take you in living in love and transform you. Surrender is a continuous process, really, because as we continue to live a transformed life, we will continue to discover more things that we can take or rid ourselves of selfishness, more layers of selfishness in our personality and our character that we never knew were there before. Little by little, we remove these layers and discover our true self, who lives in the love of God. We will see that the conflict is really deeper than we thought it was before. Surrendering our heart leads us to have a whole heart. And having a whole heart, loving God with all of our heart, leads us to the next step, or the next stage of transformation, loving God with all of our souls. And this is the study that we will have next time. We'll begin to talk about loving God with all of our souls. May God bless you.